welcome Jim Juhnke to our series this morning. He's a retired Bethel professor of history. He's authored several books. He's originally from the Elyria area, but he attended this church for 2 years and lived in Buhler for 2 years when he was in grade school, and his father was a teacher here. So we're looking forward to see what he has to say this morning. Let's bow for prayer. Our Father, we're grateful for this opportunity together this morning, and we ask your help in seeing from your perspective things that have happened in the past. Amen. Jim?
Morning. Actually, I was 4 and 5 years old. It was before I was in grade school that I attended here. We lived 1 block just south of here, so we didn't have far to go to church then. Unfortunately, I don't have very keen or vivid memories of this church. I did become a history teacher like my father was before me. So, and when I came to study the Mennonites in Kansas and their history and our history, I learned that the most important event in that history, particularly the early, the first 50 years, was the First World War, which is now exactly 100 years ago. We are celebrating the 100th anniversary of World War I. And the repression, the hostility against German Americans, and particularly German Americans who refused military service, reached its most intense time during the spring of 1918, and climaxed, as we'll see here, in November, at the end of the war. Unlike wars since Vietnam, this was a relatively short war. The United States entered the war in Europe in June of 1917, and the war lasted the rest of 1917 and then nearly all of 1918, but a year and a half and the war was over. Unfortunately, the war wasn't against Spain or Denmark or something. It was against Germany, and that just made things more difficult for us. I'm going to take time to talk about 4 incidents of violence against Mennonites in Kansas, and then we can have some time for discussion after that. The first story is about Walter Cooprider, who was the son of an American Civil War veteran who had married a Mennonite widow. During the war, they were members of the West Liberty Old Mennonite Church in McPherson County. Walter had one son, who was conscripted into the military and was at Camp Funston, and 2 sons at home. He refused to buy war bonds. Now, there was no special tax. Times have changed. Back at the beginning of the century, we fought wars by asking people to pay for it voluntarily. World War I expenses were not paid for primarily by taxes. They were paid for by the gifts of individual citizens, and then the whole country was organized with war bond committees that raised money for the war, and these were bonds. After the war, you would be able to redeem them for 3.5% interest. But there was no law requiring anybody to buy war bonds. This was not officially a tax. It was just social pressure. In the view of the Woodrow Wilson administration, this was a way of capital, as they put it, capitalizing the profound impulse called patriotism. Well, the historical anti-German war spirit extended to McPherson, Kansas. On the night of April 22, 1918, a mob from McPherson went to the Cooprider home several miles south and west of the city. They cut the telephone wires so nobody could call out and get help. And then they called Mr. Cooprider out of the house and gave him one last chance to buy bonds. He again refused, and the mobsters told him to get into a sheet that they had there to be tarred and feathered. His son, George, who had been watching from an upstairs window, ran out into the yard and asked if he could take his father's place, because his father, Walter, had not been in good health. The mob leaders consulted with each other and decided it was okay if the son would take the father's place. They took off George's clothes, put him onto the sheet, and rolled him around in the tar and feathers. I first learned this story one Sunday morning in 1967 when my wife Anna and I attended the West Liberty Mennonite Church, and the Coopriders invited us for Sunday dinner. Mrs. Cooprider and Anna were in the kitchen while her husband was telling me this story in the living room. Mrs. Cooprider said she wished he wouldn't talk about this so much because it always made him upset. But Walter was convinced that God had brought a young historian to the West Liberty Church that morning. He believed God had prompted him to invite the historian into their home because it was important for someone to tell the next generation what happened in 1917 and 1918. So here I am this morning, fulfilling a providential mission. In fact, much of my scholarly research focused on World War I. J. Harold Moyer and I at Bethel College collaborated on a musical drama with a plot that has a young Mennonite man taking his father's place when a violent mob comes out. Walter Cooprider died long ago, but the story lives on. The second story has to do with Diener family at Spring Valley, west of Heston. In April 1918, a similar story took place. Charles Diener and his father, D.A. Diener, were pastor and co-pastor of the Spring Valley Mennonite Church. Earlier in the day, someone nailed an American flag to the front of the Spring Valley Mennonite Church. Charles Diener admitted that he had taken it down. His case was, the flag rules are that flags shouldn't be left up overnight, in any case. The mob tarred and feathered Diener, went to the church and put tar on the door and steps, and then drove to the home of the father, D.A. Diener. By then it was 2:30 a.m. They tarred and feathered him as well. They still refused to buy war bonds. A few weeks later, the mob went back to the Diener home. This time, the pastor wrote out a check for $50 to the American Red Cross. The mob left. The next day, Pastor Diener went to town and stopped payment on the check. But he agreed to pay $75 to the Friends Reconstruction Service, which was, in his view, and I guess actually less directly related to making war. On June 3, the mob from Canton came out the third time to the Diener home. This time, the pastor wrote out a check for $50 to the American, no, that was the earlier time here. Reverend Diener later described this, and I'm quoting him: "They ransacked the house from cellar to garret." I guess garret is what we used to use for attic. "They daubed my new house with paint inside and out, and did the same to the automobile. They tore off my underwear, struck me a dozen times or more with a large strap, bruising my flesh and cutting the skin open. I was dragged to the barn and abused." And we can guess what he meant by abuse here. That wasn't willing to describe. "After which they applied carboline roofing paint to my body, followed by feathers. The carbolic acid in the paint made me very sore, and my body, face, and hands were badly swollen. When they left, they threatened me that they would come again and hang me the next time." So much for the way he described it. I interviewed both of these families and did not find out until well after the interviews that the stories did not end heroically. Faced with these credible threats of execution if they would not buy war bonds, Walter Cooprider and D.A. Diener eventually went to the towns of McPherson and to Canton and made token purchases of war bonds. Well, our title here is Faithfulness Under Test. Were they unfaithful? More unfaithful than the dozens of Mennonites who did buy war bonds, including probably your relatives. Certainly my grandfather bought 50, I saw in his financial records he bought $50, a $50 bond. Was their decision to buy a bond preferable to that of the Hutterite brothers from South Dakota, the Hofer brothers, who were absolute and uncompromising in their resistance to military service? In their case, it wasn't war bonds. But the result of their resistance was that they died at Fort Leavenworth. Maybe we can talk about this in a few minutes. When is death better than compromise? My third story is from the Emmaus Mennonite Church near Whitewater. It was that same month, April 1918. Butler County, pastor of the Emmaus Church, Bernard W. Harder, was visited by a mob in broad daylight. The Canton and McPherson mobs came at night. The mob from Burton came out in the middle of the day. Bernard Harder was pastor at the Emmaus Church, where the services were still in the German language. He showed his own German cultural sympathy by the names of his sons. One son was Goethe, one son was Schiller. Well, that was middle names, John Schiller Harder and Bernard Goethe Harder. There was a patriotic rally at Whitewater. A high school girl gave a patriotic reading that ridiculed the person who wrote the popular song, "I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier." That was written and sung, one of the most popular songs in America in the time when after the war had broken out in Europe in August of 1914, but before the United States entered. And in that time of discussion about the war and the possibility of entering the war, someone wrote this song: I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. I raised him up to be my pride and joy. Well, now that song during the war enthusiasm in the spring of 1918 was a matter of shame and ridicule. As the rally in Whitewater was dying down, someone said that the German farmers out in the country were not willing to fly the American flag. And he said, I'm going to go out and check on this. And so a group of people got into their cars and went out to the Harder farmstead. Bernard W. Harder and his son were fixing the roof on the hen house when they saw the line of cars coming from Whitewater, as Mr. Harder told me when I interviewed him, like a funeral procession over the hill. When the mob met Harder on the farmyard, they asked why he didn't fly the American flag. He said he had nothing against the flag, and they had one that they brought out, and he allowed them to nail the flag onto his front porch. Well, that didn't seem to satisfy the people who came out. So Reverend Harder, pretty creative person, he taught grade school in the Emmaus private school, and as part of the grade school services or opening school opening, they would sing the Star Spangled Banner or America, since they were in America. Well, Mr. Harder, standing on the porch in front of this angry mob, said, well, since we're all good patriots here, let's sing America. Okay. The crowd had no choice but to sing along, as far as they knew the words. Bernard Harder knew the words for all 4 verses, and he had a strong voice, and he sang out 4 verses, and by the 3rd and 4th verse, he was singing alone. And the mob was sort of nervously shoving their feet in the dirt and the sand or whatever. So the mob got in their cars and left, their cup of violence unfilled. The mob had been out-Americanized by a Mennonite pastor. It's a very different story from the Coop Rider and Diener stories. The mob did go to Harder's uncle, or was it his father, who was a minister and elder of the Emmaus Church. It turned out that Elder Harder also had no objection to flying the flag, so the mob went back to Whitewater. In the weeks after the mob action, German-speaking Mennonites did not come to Whitewater to do their shopping. They went to Newton and Wichita and so forth. So some of the more level-headed and concerned leaders in town called for a public meeting to talk about this and invited the Mennonite leaders to come to the public meeting. They invited a public speaker to come from Wichita to talk about patriotism, false, misguided patriotism, and true patriotism. He called the citizens to build up the community and not to tear it down. And that relieved some of the tensions, and I guess the Mennonites bought their groceries in Whitewater again after all. My fourth story has to do with the Schrag family at Burton, where perhaps the most dramatic incident of mob violence took place. This was a few months later. This was on November 11, 1918. November 11 was the year, was the date that the war ended. It was Armistice Day. For decades, we celebrated Armistice Day on November 11th, until a few years ago, it was changed to Veterans Day. In any case, the citizens of Burton decided to have a victory celebration in town, and for their celebration, they thought to round up the slackers who had refused to buy war bonds. One of the slackers was John Schrag of the Hopefield Mennonite Church, Hoffnungsfeld Mennonite Church. It was between Burton and Mound Ridge, about halfway. Schrag lived by the Harvey County Park, just north of the Harvey County Park, where there was a wheat mill. The Burton Patriots drove out to the Schrag home. He saw them coming, ran into the house. They found him upstairs underneath the bed, dragged him out, and took him to Burton and gave him one last chance to buy bonds. He refused. They demanded that he lead a parade down Main Street, and they had a flag there. Somebody thrust the flag into his hand, or maybe not into his hand, but thrust the flag at him. He didn't take hold of it, and it fell to the ground. And someone shouted. He stepped on the American flag. The crowd then became a raging mob. Someone said, we need to hang him, and ran to the hardware store in Burton and got some yellow paint and a rope to hang him on a nearby tree. They beat him. They smeared the paint onto his face and onto his beard. He had a large beard. And he didn't offer any resistance, didn't raise his hands or anything, didn't say anything. They were about to hang him when Tom Roberts, the head of the local anti-horse thief association, interfered. Tom Roberts had a gun. The Anti-Horse Thief Association was an important organization in many towns, including in Newton, throughout Kansas. This isn't the place, but they did many things besides take the law into their own hands when somebody did something wrong, or when somebody stole a horse. We don't know of any cases in Harvey County of somebody stealing a horse and the Anti-Horse Thief Association getting the horse back. If there are cases like that, we don't know about that. But we do know that these were civic organizations. There was the Burton Baseball Club was sponsored officially by the Burton Anti-Horse Thief Association. And there are pictures of Tom Roberts with the baseball players in the newspaper. Well, Roberts carried a gun. And when the mob had the rope and they were going to hang Schrag to this tree, Roberts got himself between Schrag and the mob, picked out his gun, and held it up and said, "We're not going to hang this man. This is America. People who are guilty of something are tried in court before they are punished. I'm not going to allow you to kill this man except over my dead body." And he got on the main street in Burton, there's building is still there. There was a little, they called it a calaboose, a small one-room jail, and Roberts got Schrag into the jail, closed the door. The door had some bars on it. He allowed people to walk past the door of the jail and to shout insults at Schrag and to spit on him or whatever. And Roberts called the Harvey County Sheriff in Newton to come out, and he did, and picked up Schrag, took him for that night to the jail in Newton, and got him cleaned up and allowed him to go home. He was released because there were no charges against him. I mean, there was no reason for the sheriff to keep him in prison. Less than a month later, however, the Burton citizens brought a legal case against Schrag before a judge in Wichita in the district court for him to be bound over to trial for having violated the Espionage Act. There were two laws, first the Espionage Act and then a more stringent one, the Sedition Act, that were passed during the war, which made it illegal to criticize the government for its war policies, made it illegal to discourage anyone from fulfilling their military duties, and made it illegal to say anything against the American flag or to desecrate it in any way. They didn't have anybody to present evidence against Schrag for what he had said. For one thing, he hadn't said anything. He was just completely silent during this. For another thing, nobody was willing to say that he said anything in English, and none of his accusers could understand German. Well, it was hearsay. I mean, who had dropped the flag? The judge said Schrag came as close as he could have to violating the Espionage Act. It was like he had a dozen lawyers advising him. He came that close, but he hadn't violated, and so he was not bound over for trial. He was released. He had hired a Jewish attorney. I wish I knew the name of this attorney who defended him. His attorney said, "Okay, now let's go after these people for what they did to you. That is against the law, the way you were treated." And Schrag said, "Yeah, it is, but I'm not going to." We Mennonites don't go to court, you know. Well, in this case, Mennonites in the area stopped doing business in Burton, and the town didn't make any efforts to get them back. And the town of Burton went into a severe post-war depression in the 1920s, from which Burton has, at least if you ask some of the old-timers there, Burton has never recovered from that depression. Some of their leading business people, not long after the war, moved out of town, moved to other towns, and so on. From the Mennonite point of view, now, my experience conducting the interviews, one could talk at length about all of these interviews are in the Mennonite Library and Archives. Most of them have been transcribed, so you can read the transcript there. One of John Schrag's sons, he had a number of sons. One was alienated from his father, said this whole incident was his father's fault. It wouldn't have been necessary. He could have avoided mob action. I had a very stubborn father. I talked to other people who said that Schrag was a hard person to get along with the rest of his life. Maybe some of you, one of his major development projects as a farm developer, he bought the basin. There was west of McPherson, there was a low lake, the McPherson Basin. He bought that, dammed up the water flowing into the basin, and built a major trench along the roads, along the ditches, the public roads, to drain the basin into the Blaze Fork River. And he put the basin into agricultural production just in time for the great drought of the 1930s. And during the 1930s, when everybody else wasn't growing any corn or whatever, the basin was just producing. And John Schrag, he was a wealthy man. He could have afforded to buy war bonds, but he didn't, of course, didn't believe in that. But the farmers whose land had been encroached on to make that ditch from the basin to the Blaze Fork were not happy. We're not happy that somebody was pushing into their territory. Anyway, what I learned when I was doing interviews about this, somebody told me that there was a man in Hutchinson who had been a part of the mob and who was willing to talk about it. Now that's unusual. That's unusual. So I got in touch with Charles Gordon in Hutchinson and did an interview with him. He said he was a young man due to be drafted. If the war had lasted longer, he would have been drafted. On November 11th in the morning, he was working out in the field, and some of his friends came and told him, "You got to come into town. They're bringing in some of these Germans who refused to buy bonds." And he came and sort of watched the development of this mob. He said, and now I'm quoting from the interview, "He never fought back, raised his voice, or resisted when smeared with yellow paint. Indeed, he looked like the non-resistant Christ." I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "You know those images of Christ, the paintings of Christ that some people have in their living rooms with a halo? That's what he looked like." And then he said, "Because of John Schrag, I became a conscientious objector." Refusing military service? You became a Mennonite? He said, "No, you don't have to be a Mennonite to be for peace." he made me feel a little bit ashamed of myself for asking that question. No, I have been a member of the Assemblies of God. But he said, I've told my Sunday school classes about John Schrag my whole life. Well, what do the stories of Koopreider, Diener, Harder, and Schrag and their families tell us about our Christian faith? Stories create community. They connect us to our roots and establish our identity. They teach us moral lessons. They can inspire and renew us. And we ought to tell stories to the next generation. I haven't told all of the mob stories. One of the mob victims was Otto Juhnke, my great uncle, my grandfather's brother, who lived west of McPherson. Mob came out to his place. My parents, nobody told me the story about my great uncle being visited by a mob. I didn't find out about it until my parents told me more than a year after I had started studying the Mennonite experience in World War I. Why is this true? Maybe because these stories are embarrassing, at least to one generation of Mennonites. They remind us when our people were not acceptable citizens. There's another issue that I'll just raise before we go to the question period, and that has to do with the Mennonite historical sense of being a persecuted people. There are some younger historians, I don't know if any of you know Ben Gosen, who's made a name for himself by exposing the extent to which Mennonites in Europe and Paraguay cooperated with the Nazis. He laments the fact that Mennonites imagine themselves to be a persecuted people. That was long in the past, and it's not functional for us who are not persecuted. We're prosperous. Nobody's standing in our way. In fact, more than the people around us, maybe we have a chance to get education, to go into business, a variety of opportunities, to cultivate our sense of being a persecuted people is dysfunctional, Ben Gosen says. Why should we tell these stories even? Well, I don't know if there's a simple answer to that question. There's something to what Ben is saying, I guess. Maybe some of you have questions or answers to that. Do you think that's an issue? Who wants to get us started here?
Raise your hand, I'll bring the mic to you.
In my mind, I'm comparing this story that you're telling to the violence that is going on today about racial tension. The blacks in particular have, they've been telling their story of persecution and are taking it forward now to justify violence, to end it.
Okay, is there a relationship between John Schrag refusing to carry the flag at the head of a parade and the NFL black fellows who kneel instead of standing at the playing of the national anthem. Is there any connection there? And one could say not just the blacks, the Muslims too. Quite a few Muslim mosques have been burned down. One a few years ago, just across the border in Joplin, Missouri. In fact, in Wichita, somebody tried to burn down a mosque. The fire was caught before the whole thing burned down, but yeah, by telling these stories, we can remember or think about blacks and Muslims in a different way.
In a more sympathetic way.
Yeah.
But I think our lessons need, if they can teach us a better way for now, then all of the lessons are good. If we forget that there was persecution, it could very easily start up again. We need to learn the lesson from it, that this is wrong for our country, for our faith.
Maybe we need to tell these stories, but not tell them every Sunday. Not get obsessed with them and think that's the meaning of our peoplehood.
I'm going back into the history in my family. This is during World War II. Well, when Prussia was overriding all of Europe, my grandfather came across. He was a stowaway on a ship. I came to Bethel College and checked, and could not find his name on any of the manifests. And my one uncle says, oh yeah, he came across legally and he had money in his pocket. The other uncle, who I trust, said no, he was a stowaway. He came and had to make his own way. But what really caused him to do that, to take that action, was that they were conscripting all of the young men for the Prussian army. And he was able to, he was kind of slippery. He hid in several areas of the farm that they couldn't find him. But his neighbor down the road, the young man tried to stay away from him too, but his parents had been brought out of the house, had all the family lined up, and the baby was in a mother's arms, and they grabbed the baby and threw him up in the air and shot him, just to reinforce that they have to have those young men.
The horrible stories of what happened in Russia and Prussia, in the Ukraine, in Germany during World War I and World War II remind us that the Kansas Mennonite World War I stories, as dramatic as they may sound, no one was killed. The mobs came very close to killing John Schrock. No one was killed, and no churches were burned. There were 2 churches burned in Oklahoma, and 1 in Michigan, but Mennonite churches. But here in Kansas, that didn't happen. We got some yellow paint on the church doors and windows, but so that needs to be, put into context and perspective a little bit. What do you think about Mennonites who refuse to buy war bonds and then, when they're threatened with death, do, after all, make a token purchase?
I do the same thing.
What?
I do the same thing.
Let's recognize that if we were in the same circumstances, what would we do? Maybe what I'd do would be to buy bonds in the first place. I don't know.
I think to not do as that man did, and to give yourself up as a martyr, only history will determine if you were a martyr. But if you go through the motion, you make the token purchase, you at least save your life for a period of time to where you can tell the story and you can still talk to people and educate people and continue on and have those opportunities. But if you engage in an activity which you know will result in your death, it's a short story.
Yeah.
That was a long walk. Well, as I was listening to you, I was thinking of our taxing structure that we have now, and the the subtleties of it are far greater consequences than buying war bonds, because we now pay out, according to the last figure, somewhere between 40 and 50% of our tax dollars go toward ways to kill people. So, I think we might have more to protest now than even the war bond example. Many people work very diligently to try to reduce their tax load, and under the idea that I don't want to pay any more than what I have to, but we're still paying some. We're not protesting, really. So is there a point at which we should protest more openly?
You know, the United States government is an amazingly effective government in dealing with protest. For many years, the General Conference Mennonite Church argued at length about the question of should the church withhold tax from the workers, people working for the church who don't want to pay taxes, who would refuse to pay taxes. Why? We argued about that, and then we even had a special, where was this? In Minnesota, we had about 25 years ago, we had a special conference, a mid-triennium conference, just to talk about this one issue. The result of all of this was that the church finally came to a consensus, a reasonable consensus, and decided to disobey the Internal Revenue Service and not to withhold income tax from the employees who didn't want the withholding. We were told by tax experts that we could expect a major legal case against the church by Internal Revenue Service. What happened? Nothing. Internal Revenue Service did not initiate any kind of action against the church. I think they understood, maybe they waited a little bit to see if other churches, if the Quakers, if the Brethren, if this would become a movement. Nobody else was following it, and IRS simply went to the people who were refusing and collected individually from their bank accounts, plus a little bit expense, and the issue just evaporated. The government could have had a huge battle on its hands, and they just ignored it. That's American democracy sometimes works effectively to diminish protest. That's, I think we're past our time, right?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jim.
Sure enough.
And I think we have cookie social now, so I'm sure there's more opportunity to visit. Thank you.
I have two beautiful children. One is named Emerson. My daughter is Emerson. She's 7 years old. And then I have Lincoln. Lincoln is my boy. My boy is 4 years old. And they're the blessing of my life.
I have a son named Austin. Austin turned 15 in February. Austin was born with Down syndrome. And 4 years ago, Katie and I started fostering Austin. He was a student in my classroom. And then 2 years ago, Katie and I ended up adopting Austin as our own.
I have three children, Shannon, who is 32, Michael, who is 30, and Sarah, who is 21. And I also have two grandchildren, Ethan, who's 5, and Naomi, who's 3.
What brings me joy about my children is seeing them grow, to see that, or bring me joy to just come home and them to hug me after a long day of work, and to see my children wanting to run into my arms and tell me that they love me.
The biggest thing that brings me joy about Austin is his affection. Austin has this unbelievable gift of knowing where somebody's heart is. He'll ask us if he hasn't heard us laugh for a while. He'll say, John, laugh. Katie, laugh. Just because he gets so much joy from us having joy.
I think the greatest joy is watching our children grow. It's been very interesting to see how each one handles things differently. And also grandchildren, The fact that they're always happy to see me, and that, as my grandson said, he will love me forever.
A most common challenge is getting ready for bed. No kid likes to get ready for bed. But Austin, you know, if he's playing with his toys or reading a book, you can say it's time to get ready for bed, and you can hear it in his voice, or you can just see it in his body language that that's not what's on his schedule. And sometimes he'll just completely ignore you and just keep doing what he's doing.
Unpredictable things. That's a challenge. It's unpredictable. Where with me and my wife, we're kind of predictable of what we do to each other, but as the children, they're very unpredictable, and that's a challenge in itself.
I think the hardest thing at the stage of life I'm in now is watching them struggle. Grandchildren never cause trouble or challenges, but they do wear me out.
You know, Austin has really brought so much joy to Katie and I. He's done a ton for Katie and I's marriage, really has taught us how to be a team. And just from the gifts that Austin's given Katie and I in just the 2 years he's lived with us, I would give my life for Austin. He may not be my biological son, but I love him as one. I will always consider him one, and I will always treat and act as his father from birth, even though I will always know I'm not. It will never be a matter to me. It will never be an issue for me. I will do whatever I could to protect and make Austin strive in life.
I think I'd sacrifice, you know, pretty much my life for my children. I think anything. I mean, if I could provide, give them, you know, some kind of shelter or vehicle, or trying to provide them the best education, the best spiritual guidance. I think them are the things that are really critical in their lives.
Because they're a part of me, and God has given them to me and to care for, and He's entrusted us with that. And so as He gave His life for us, I could see how I couldn't do the same for my kids or give them anything that I would have.
Happy Father's Day to all the fathers out there. You know, I grew up without a father from age 6 on up. So it was a little different for me when I became a father, but it's, I think it's not something you learn, it's something that just comes from within to be a father. So at any rate, congratulations all you fathers who have raised children.